Hello, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 5.1c. And in this video, we're going to apply the concepts of changes in fiscal and monetary policy and their impacts on aggregate demand and aggregate supply to see how the government can help the economy in times of negative shocks. So remember, we have two types of government policies that can affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The first is fiscal policy, and this is a direct change in government spending, and therefore a direct change in aggregate demand. The second is monetary policy, and this is changes in the money supply that indirectly affect aggregate demand through their impact on investment spending. Remember, when we're thinking about short-run fluctuations in our economy, these are deviations from the long-run trend. In many cases, they come from either a change in the short-run aggregate supply or aggregate demand. When we have changes in the short-run aggregate supply, these are going to be called supply shocks. On the other hand, when we have changes in aggregate demand in the short run, these are going to be called demand shocks. So we want to understand when we have either supply shocks or demand shocks in our economy, how can the government respond so that the negative effects of these shocks are not felt drastically throughout the economy, or they're mitigated or made smaller. These types of interventions by the government to try to mitigate the negative effects of economic shocks is called stabilization. So let's first consider a demand shock. Let's say that we have a situation where one of our big trading partners, the European Union, is falling into a recession. And we want to know, how does this affect the US economy? Well, if the European Union is falling into a recession, the total amount of exports demanded from the US in Europe is going to fall because there's overall an economic slowdown there. So for the US, this is going to impact the net exports. Again, all else equal. Nothing else is changing. This is the only thing that we're thinking about at this point. So as a result of the recession in Europe, we expect that net exports in the US are going to fall. That's going to cause a shift in or to the left of the aggregate demand curve. This would be a demand side shock. We see that as a result of this recession in Europe, in the United States, we have a lower price level temporarily in the short run and lower output. So we're seeing that all else equal, if we only experience the change in net exports as a result of the recession, we're going to see lower output in the US. Of course, this is not good. Higher unemployment, nobody's happy with that. So the government can step in and try to promote growth. They can try to promote growth and shift the aggregate demand curve closer to the long-run equilibrium so that it curbs the negative effects coming from the drop in net exports. It can do this in two ways, either through expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy. In both cases, that's going to cause a shift out or to the right of the aggregate demand curve. It's going to promote growth as output increases and unemployment falls, but it also is going to come at the cost of higher inflation because the price level is going to rise. Now, let's think about a supply shock. Let's say that we have a situation where the price of copper skyrockets. Copper is used heavily in the manufacturing of many goods in the United States, as well as in technology. So if that's the case, what's going to happen in the aggregate economy? Copper is an input in production, so that already tells you that we're going to have a shift in our aggregate supply curve. Now, which one? Long run, short run, or both? Well, we're going to assume that this is a temporary change in the price of copper, and therefore we're only going to shift the short run aggregate supply. The price of copper becomes very high, cost of production is very high. We see a shift in or to the left of the short-run aggregate supply. The short-run economic fluctuation that we experience is an increase in the price level and a decrease in output. So that indicates that inflation is rising and unemployment is rising, two things that the government really does not like. So what do we combat? So how can the government combat this? Well, the only tools that they have affect just aggregate demand. They cannot affect the short-run aggregate supply. So they have to choose, Are we going to promote growth and lower unemployment, or are we going to combat inflation and try to drive the price level down? So let's say they choose to try to curb inflation. The only policy that's really going to work is going to be contractionary monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve is going to be the one that is most concerned with inflation, and it's going to be the one enacting policies specifically to try to curb the inflation if it's high in the economy. So therefore, to be able to curb the negative effects of this short-run supply shock, the Federal Reserve can choose to use contractionary monetary policy, moving the new equilibrium to point C, dropping the price level down, curbing inflation, but notice that this is coming at a higher cost in terms of more unemployment. Output falls further, and now we're faced with even greater unemployment. So let's look at the flip side. We have our short-run supply shock, and now the government decides that they want to actually promote growth and curb the high unemployment. To do that, they need to shift the aggregate demand curve out or to the right. To do this, they can either employ expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy. Both policies are going to have an effect on the aggregate demand curve and shift it out or to the right. As a result, we move to a new equilibrium, such as point C. And now we can see that we have an increase in our output, indicating that we have lower unemployment, but we also have an increase in the price level, indicating that inflation is rising. So with this series of policies, yes, the government is curbing the negative effects of slower growth and higher unemployment, but it is coming at the cost of higher inflation. So the government has to choose what is the best thing for it to do. Now, the role of the government when it enacts policies that affect the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, or more generally, the aggregate economy, again, is to try to stabilize the economy in times when there are negative shocks, either negative demand shocks or negative supply shocks. Again, this is called stabilization, and there are many economists for and against the idea of stabilization. One of the benefits is that it can help alleviate the negative effects that come from higher inflation or higher unemployment, especially when we see a supply shock and it's a temporary shock due to a change in the price of a resource. We don't know how long that's going to last. It could last 1 quarter, it could last 1 year, it could last 5 years. So if the government wants to curb those effects, they can enact those policies immediately. Now, some of the drawbacks of stabilization are that when enacting these policies, it might be too late once those policies actually are put into place, and the economy might have already changed. This would lead to an overshooting or undershooting of the policy goals in their effect on the aggregate economy. In addition, there are already automatic stabilizers in place, such as tax policies that are progressive, that may alleviate automatically the negative effects of demand and supply shocks. Thank you so much for joining me in this module 5.1C.